Aloha kako. My name is Pele Bauch, and I'm honored to be performing here today with Kahu Olilai O'o, Kris Kato. We are offering Oli, Mele, and Hula, Hawaiian chant, song, and dance, island to island. From our home base here, Lenapehoking, also known as New York, we are calling from this little island all the way to the island of Oahu in Hawaii, our other home.
Ke pili lau olu olu anui. Au he avaleo e kaua no e kaua ko ia vea vei ke kula. Ua o kaua le koko ula. Ke pili lau olu olu anui.
The chant you just heard speaks of the love for the rain and a place on the island of Oahu called Ko'olaupoko. We have a saying in Hawaii about the rain, Ue kalani ola kahonua. The heavens cry and the earth lives. And now with grace and aloha, it is our pleasure to share with you a song from the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 1970s. This is a song that speaks of the different flowers on the island of Oahu. Velina Oahu. Velina Oahu me ka leilima walihi alani ka heke o nā pua. Aiala ka pua keni keni e mapu mai ana no ko o lau poko. Kui ana ka lau I ke konane awe hiki no inu ke ala pikake. Iluna kaulana o puo waina melia mauloa I ka wai ho olu. Hi hapu mai ai o e kau I haupua e nei.
Aloha. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Westbeth Day at Little Island. So I assume, you're on Little Island, so I assume you know what that is. But if you're wondering what Westbeth is, it is the oldest and largest affordable artist housing complex in the United States, if not the world. And it's right across the street. We have a lot of Westbeth residents here tonight, and I'm so grateful to welcome all of you. My name is Erin Quinn Purcell, and I'm president of the Westbeth Artist Residence Council. I'm just gonna get house all night. Let's hear it again for the amazing Pele Bauch and Kris Kato. Pele actually grew up in Westbeth, which was established in 1970, so it's an honor to have her here as an incredibly talented artist and native Westbethian, and we're also grateful for her honoring the original native inhabitants of the land we stand on today. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage multidisciplinary artist, Grammy-nominated musician, Westbeth resident, Theo Bleckmann, and the equally amazing Erik Deutsch.
I think there's going to be a martini coming soon here. Thank you for being here. Erik Deutsch is in town from a trip with the Black Crows. He's playing with the Black Crows and he has a day off and he decided to join us here. We're going to do a Judy Sill song, Lopin' Along Through the Cosmos, if this keyboard ever turns on. Test, test, 1, 2.
I have 5 minutes of material if you guys want to hear it. A hot 5. I'm just...
Wait. Play and turn it on.
Loping along through the cosmos, and sideways I slide through the square. I'm hoping so hard for a kiss from God. I miss the sweet love of the air. A silver chariot soars through mercury ripples of sky. I'm looking so hard for a place to land. I almost forgot how to fly. So keep on moving or stay by my side. Either way, I'll tell you a secret I've never revealed. However we are is okay. Loping along through the cosmos and sideways and slide through the square. I'm hoping so hard for a kiss from God. I miss the sweet love of the air. A silver chariot soars through mercury ripples of sky. I'm looking so hard for a place to land. I almost forgot how to fly. So keep on moving or stay by my side. Either way, I'll tell you a secret I've never revealed. However we are, so keep on moving or stay by my side. Either way, I tell you a secret I've never revealed. However we are is okay. Do 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 do.
Thank you very much. However we are is okay. Isn't that sweet? Thank you. I'm supposed to stay here.
Hi,
Oh, hi there. I didn't see you there at all.
I'm right here. Surprise. Theo is one of Westbeth's newest residents, and I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite part about living at Westbeth, other than hanging out with me?
And drinking with you.
And drinking
later.
with me.
Well, the greatest thing about it is if you have a gig at Little Island, you can just walk to it. No, seriously. I have to say, my neighbors, especially my next-door neighbor, Roger.
A lot of them are here. Roger is here. Roger Brayman, ladies and
Roger
gentlemen.
Brayman.
An active volunteer with the Westbeth Artist Residence Council, former president.
When in life, at the age of 42, no, kidding, at this age, do you find somebody, living next to you that is a great friend suddenly? And, I'm really grateful for my neighbors all around, but in particular, my next-door neighbor.
Well, we're grateful for you. You're an amazing addition to the Westbeth family. Let's hear it again.
You're not going to get rid of me.
For Theo and Erik. Theo and Erik both. I'd now like to bring to the stage Executive Director of Westbeth, Peter Madden.
So my name's Peter Madden. I'm the executive director of Westbeth. In addition to housing over 600 people in our 384 apartments, Westbeth is also home to some prominent cultural institutions such as the Martha Graham Dance Company, the Kitchen, the New School's graduate drama program are all housed on our campus. And all year round, the Westbeth Gallery and Community Room present arts programming, visual arts, concerts, theater, classes, all of that amazingly run by our volunteer Westbeth Artist Resident Council, or WARC. And WARC's president, Erin, single-handedly curated tonight's event. And she's done a fantastic job, so I really want to thank her. If you are curious and want to learn more about Westbeth, I really encourage you to come to the Westbeth programming at Westside Fest, which is in 2 weekends, the 12th, 13th, and 14th of July. There's going to be open studios, which is a great way to sort of give yourself a self-guided tour of our amazing buildings. There's going to be an art and craft market. There's going to be music. There's going to be programming for kids. And there are some flyers here with some additional information on that. And lastly, really one of the greatest way to learn about Westbeth is from the comfort of your own home. Go to westbeth.org. Again, an amazing resource run by a group of volunteers, including Christina. And it's really a magnificent way to learn, keep up to date with what's going on at Westbeth, but also to learn about the amazing history and our residents. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, Peter. Next up, two of Westbeth's most prolific artists, award-winning choreographer and dancer Judith Moss, and her husband, esteemed jazz improviser Michael Moss, along with Esme Boyce and Timothy Ward, performing excerpts from a piece called Counterbalance. So much. That was death-defying. I want to give them another round of applause. The level of commitment it takes to dance in that space. Beautiful work. Like Peter was talking about, the Westbeth Artist Residence Council proudly supports free classes and workshops for people of all ages. Acting workshops, singing classes with Eve Zani, who's here, children's art shows, and we also co-sponsor a workshop led by our next guest, Westbeth resident Marianela Fernandez. Marianela has been working in partnership with the Poets and Writers Association and the Westbeth Artist Residence Council for several years, facilitating creative writing workshops in Spanish, and so we're thrilled to showcase some of their beautiful work here. Please welcome Marianela Fernandez and poet Carmen de los Santos.
Carmen de los Santos nació en Puebla, México. Disfruta de los atardeceres de otoño y se obsesiona con tener la ropa limpia. Se aburre tremendamente al cocinar. Desea ir a visitar a su familia. Se estresa fácilmente con sus sobrinos y se divierte cuando juega al fútbol. Escribe para compartir historias. Carmen de los Santos was born in Puebla, Mexico. She enjoys autumn sunsets and is obsessed with having clean clothes. She longs to visit her family. She's easily stressed out by her nephews. She writes in order to share stories.
Esas mañanas frías, neblina por todo el campo, los cacahuates y sus flores blancas, nuestros pies descalzos. Ella siempre atenta a sus hijas, tal vez preocupada. Madre, estamos bien, tranquila. Estamos acostumbradas a despertar temprano, a la tierra fría, a las piedras en el camino, al sol ardiente. Hoy me dio mucho gusto verte y pasar a tu lado un rato.
Those cold mornings, fog all over the fields, the cacahuates and their white flowers, our naked feet. She always attentive to her daughters, perhaps worried. Mother, we are fine, don't worry. We are used to waking up early, to the cold earth, to the stones on the road, to the burning sun. Today, I was very glad to see you and stay with you for a while. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Work not only sponsors classes and workshops like Marianela's, but free programming as well. We have free concerts on the first Friday of every month. We also sponsor a very popular drag bingo, which is Roger Brayman's brainchild. And that's on the third Thursday of every month, resuming in September. So I strongly suggest you check out Westbeth. And why not make a day of it? Check out the amazing offerings that they have at Little Island as well. You're going to see some amazing shows here right in this space starting in July. And of course, the shows in the AMP are amazing this season. Peter talked a little bit about the West Side Fest. Little Island is part of the West Side Cultural Network. Thank you to Farida and Michael for sponsoring this amazing event and letting us come out and perform for you. As Peter said, you can get more information about West Side Fest on westsidefest.nyc. And now, a performer that needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Actor, writer, director, 6-time Obie Award winner, Westbeth resident, and my friend, David Greenspan.
Hey there. Yay. What I'm going to perform for you this evening, read for you actually, is an excerpt from the last scene in a play of mine called Odysseus. It's a new play, it's yet to be produced, and it's modeled on James Joyce's Ulysses and Homer's Odyssey. It's set in the present time, except for one scene, I'll tell you about that, on the east end of Long Island during the course of a summer weekend. There is an Odysseus character, his name is Jacob, and he is far away, not literally, but emotionally. For several reasons, he is yet to come home. And there is a Telemachus character, Telemachus being the son of Odysseus, and it's Jacob's son. His name is Ethan, and Ethan is also at sea. When the play begins, he's unable to make a full marital commitment to his longtime boyfriend, Oliver. And Oliver is talked about during the course of the play, but he doesn't appear until the last scene, as I'm going to read to you. Near the end of the play, Ethan resolves his conflict. He returns to New York, where Oliver is waiting. The last scene takes place many years later. Ethan has died. You'll hear about that in the monologue. And Oliver is much older. The only other thing you need to know is that Gertrude Stein has played an offstage part in the play. She's been an influence on the play. and you'll hear that represented. I hope you enjoy it. And this is the character of Oliver. Yes. Yes, in that first night we made out madly, and kissed madly, and sexed madly, and you kissed my face, and I thought you were so handsome I would die, that you would never stay with me, never love me, never could. And in the morning we spoke of the last words at Joyce, and I thought, yes, yes. Yes, and perhaps there is no happiness but that peace we make for ourselves, to find for ourselves the love we crave in loving someone else, no matter what or what cannot be returned, yes. That we find our way in finite time, living every moment we have lived in the present moment, yes. That we are made of what we were before, made of the same as stars, yes. That I find you in time again as we were that first night of the years that passed, yes. And you drove back that night, and I woke and we spoke, yes. And in the morning you woke late because the drive back had been late, yes. And you said, yes, would I? And I said, yes, with who else would I, yes. And stay with me, you said, yes. And I said, where would I go, yes. And besides, I said, you love me. You have loved me more than anyone has ever loved me, more than anyone you have loved, yes. And you too have passed on, Ethan, yes. You are gone, Ethan, and I am older, yes. But that morning, as we sat at breakfast, I read to you from Stein, the end of business in Baltimore, yes and yes and more and yes and why and yes and yes and why and yes. I knew better and best and yes and better and most and yes and better and best and yes and more and best and better and most and yes. And yes and better and yes and more and yes and better and yes and more and yes and better and yes and more and yes and more and best and yes and better and most and yes and more and better and best and most and yes and most and better and yes and most and more and yes and more and yes and better and yes and most and yes and best and yes and better and yes and more and yes and best and yes and better and yes and more and yes and most and yes and more and yes and better and yes and most and yes and best and yes and better and most and yes and better and most and yes and more and most and yes and better and most and yes and more and better and yes and more and best and yes and more and best and yes and more and yes and best and yes and more and yes and better and yes and best and yes and more and yes and better and yes and yes and yet more and better and yes and better and yes and more and yes and better and yes and better and yes and more and yes and best and better and yes and most and more and yes and better and yes and best and more and better and more and yes and better and yes and yes and more and yes and better and yes and more and yes and more and yes and more and yes and more and better and yes and best and more and yes and better and yes and most and yes and better and more and yes and better and more and better and yes and more and better and more and yes and yes and better and yes and more and yes and more and best and better and most and better and best and more and most and better and yes and yes. You said yes. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have one more act for you, but before we bring them up, I just want to thank all of the performers and give them a huge round of applause. These are some of the best performers in New York City, in my opinion. And I love you for coming out to see live performance. It's a real revolutionary act in the digital age that we're living in. So give yourselves a round of applause for coming out. I also want to give a huge round of applause to the crew, who basically said yes and yes and yes to me with all the crazy, insane things. So please give them a huge round of applause. Their act was as Herculean as the dance number you saw, with bringing everything on and off and just accommodating us. And now, please join me in welcoming, representing Pride, representing the best of downtown theater with their Betty rules, representing art as activism and awesomeness, and tonight we're so lucky to have them representing Westbeth. Everyone, please give it up for Betty!
Hi everybody, we're Betty. Oh, some of you know and some of you are Betty virgins, so here's what happens. Listen carefully. When we say, hi, we're Betty, that's your cue to scream back at us. Hello, Betty!
With a lot of enthusiasm.
And a lot of love.
Are you ready? Sit up. Take a deep breath. We believe in you. And here's your cue. Hi, we're Betty.
What the world needs now. 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 What the world needs now.
It's the only thing that
is
just to really love. What the world needs now.
Needs now.
Love,
What the
sweet
world
love.
needs now.
No,
not
not
just
but
for
for
everyone. Lord, we don't need another mountain. There are mountains and hillsides enough to climb. There are oceans and rivers enough to cross, enough to last till the end of time. What the world needs now. What the world needs now.
It's the only thing that lives just to really love. What the world needs now is love,
What the
sweet
world
love.
needs now.
No,
Not
not
just
but
for
for
everyone. Lord, we don't need another meadow. There are cornfields and wheat fields enough to grow. There are sunbeams and moonbeams enough to shine, enough to last, you know.
No, 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 love, sweet love. What the world needs now.
What the world needs now. What the world needs is love. Ain't it true? Ain't it the truth? Yes, you guys.
Everybody looks so good. I want to take a selfie.
Smile.
I'll send it to my mom.
You all look amazing. I wish you could see what we see. It's just pure love, and I don't know, I guess I'm proud to be standing on this stage, looking at all the love and feeling it coming right back. These days, people seem to tell you that you can't be proud about yourself. What? I know, it's true. Well, we're here to tell you that you can be very proud of everything that yeah, it's true. Your size, your age, your different ways of getting from place to place. So we're here as a band, and I guess as singers, darn it, to sing a little song about maybe just showing that pride in a big, loud, curvy way. This song is for all you chubby chasers out there. Some of us really appreciate you. It's a brand new song, and it's called Big Size Love.
Oh, you might have to turn that up.
Generous. Don't be judgy.
Don't be judgy.
I'm still chubby.
I'm still chubby.
I never lost my baby fat. Soft and squishy.
Soft and squishy.
So delicious.
So delicious.
Close your eyes. Now picture that. How much more me can you love when there's more of me. Don't be a meanie.
Don't be a meanie.
I'm not skinny.
I'm not skinny.
Showing off my thicker bits. Hold on tightly.
Hold on tightly.
Enjoy the ride.
Enjoy the ride.
Or find yourself somewhere else to sit. How much more of me can you love when there's more of me? How much more of me can you love? Are you tired yet? Working hard, I'll bet. Oh,
Come and get your big size fun. Big size love is just
are
begun.
you tired yet? Working hard, I'll bet.
Come and get your big size fun. Big size love has just begun.
Come and get your big size love, I'll tell you when you're done. Skip the scale.
Skip the scale.
Diets fail.
Diets fail.
If you wanna hold me, arms out wide for the juicy side. Lose the stress.
Lose the stress.
Let out the dress.
Let out the dress.
If you wanna hug me, arms out wide for the juicy side. How much more of me can you love when there's more of me? How much more of me can you love? Are you tired yet? Working hard, I'll bet. Ooh.
Come and get your big size fun. Big size love has just begun.
Are you tired yet? Working hard, I'll bet, yeah.
Come and get your big size fun. Big size love has just begun.
Are you tired yet? Woo! Working hard, I'll bet.
Come and get your big size fun. Big size love has just begun.
Come and get your big size love, I'll tell you when you're done. Ow!
1X, 2X, 3XL.
Good and plenty.
1X, 2X, 3XL.
Plenty, good. 1X, 2X, 3XL. Bit of honey under my plus size belt. Come and get
Big size fun.
big size love. Come and get
Big size fun.
big size love. All of
Come and get
me,
big size
yeah.
fun.
Big size love. Come and get
Big size fun.
big size love.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been such a beautiful gathering today. So many old friends, so many new friends, so many friends from DC, friends from everywhere. This has been amazing. Thank you for coming out on this gorgeous day. One more time, thanks to Aaron for pulling this all together.
I just have one thing to say. I really, really want to live at Westbeth. My name is Elizabeth, and I really want to live at Westbeth. Okay?
You know what? Dreams come true, Elizabeth. A lot of people will tell you that.
It's a dream.
Tomorrow you all can come to Stonewall, I think. It's at
That's right.
Hudson Yards. We're going to be performing there. Of course, it's going to be a completely different show because this is the most important show we've ever done in our entire performing careers.
Of course. 38 years, by the way. 38
We've been
years.
together 38 years.
Anyway,
If you want to find out more, you can go to our website, which is hellobetty.com. Like, hello, kitty. Anyway, we have...
Aaron, do we have time to just do a little giveaway? Yes. Okay, friends. Because we're Betty, we've been together for 38 years, we have a new, hello sweetie. We have a new album coming out later on this year, and we have a new single we're gonna be doing for you. And we have a shirt that has to do with it. And this is gonna be somebody's shirt right here, right now. Oh, you can wave your hand all you want to. That's not how you win a shirt, my friends. This is New York. You have to earn that shirt. And the way you're going to earn that shirt is you're not going to scream out anything. You're going to raise your hand if you know the answer. Okay, Betty Grable. This is your Betty trivia question. Because the band is Betty. It is a hard one, isn't it? Betty Grable. It has a very famous pinup shot like this. Does everybody remember? Yes. From World War II.
Do you all know who Betty Grable was? Yes. All right.
The reason Betty Grable's back was turned was because she was pregnant and showing. Can anybody tell me? Do not scream it out. Raise your hand if you think you know. How many months pregnant was she? Right there. 3. No, I'm sorry, my dear. That's not true. What do you say? 9. Oh, bless your heart. No. 7 is not true. Who else wants to give a try? What do you say? 4 is not right. What do you say? Oh, winner right there. She was 6 months pregnant. Bravo, Sam. Couldn't be happier.
that's your name, Sam? Sam's the big winner. Give it up for Sam, everybody.
Bravo, Sam. Bravo.
But you all can be winners because we just opened a brand new merch store online for the first time in 38 years.
You can walk around New York City proud as a peacock with one of those things on. Just try it and see. Hey everybody, happy Pride. So much fun performing for all of you. Let's give ourselves a big hand, shall we?
Here's to all of us for being proud for all of our friends.
You can get up and dance.
If they try to stop us, time to rise, time to rise, time to rise. If they try to stop us, time to rise, time to rise, time to rise. Who's proud today? I'm proud today. You're proud today. Let's love all the way. Who's proud today? I'm proud today. You're proud today. Let's love all the way. Clap your hands way up high. Shout it out. Happy Pride. Clap your hands way up high. Shout it out. Love all the way. Love all the way. Hoo hoo. Hoo hoo.